Is blindness a barrier? No.
Is deafness a barrier? No.
Are mobility, learning, cognitive disabilities, speech impairments and others, or even a combination of them, barriers? No way. Lack of accessibility is.
Welcome to Web Accessibility for All.
Follow the blind. This journey starts now.
Welcome back to Web Accessibility for All, the podcast where we break down the world of accessibility one episode at a time. I am Ariel, and today we're going to have a talk about a topic that often confuses even the most seasoned accessibility professionals: the relationship between the ADA, the Section 508, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. We'll explore how these regulations and guidelines interact, what is most important, and where they might differ. Plus, we'll look at some practical examples to help you navigate these waters with confidence. Let's get started. Now, let me tell you the plan for today. We're going to pretend to have a conversation between Susan, an IT accessibility auditor, George, our newbie developer buddy, and myself. Hey, Susan, great to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ariel.
George, welcome aboard.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
The ADA, Section 508, and WCAG.
All right, let's begin with the basics. The ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, was enacted in 1990, and it's a broad civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, on the other hand, is more specific, focusing on making federal electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. But Susan, where do the WCAG fit into all of this?
Great question, Ariel. The WCAG, developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, is a set of technical guidelines that describe how to make web content more accessible. These guidelines are not laws themselves, but they are often referenced by laws like the ADA and Section 508 as the standard for web accessibility.
So, if I follow WCAG, then I'm good with both the ADA and Section 508, right?
Not exactly. While the WCAG are widely accepted as the gold standard for web accessibility, the way they're applied under the ADA and Section 508 can differ.
Well said, Susan. Let's break it down.
ADA and WCAG, a broad application.
Under the ADA, web accessibility is about ensuring equal access to public spaces, including digital ones. But here is the tricky part. The ADA doesn't explicitly mention websites or the WCAG. However, courts have often looked to the WCAG as a benchmark for determining whether a website is accessible under the ADA.
That's right. The ADA is more about the outcome, ensuring that people with disabilities can access the same information and services as everyone else. The WCAG provide a technical roadmap for achieving that outcome, but the ADA is less prescriptive about how you get there.
Wow, so, I could, technically, be compliant with the ADA, without meeting every single WCAG criterion, right?
Potentially, yes. The focus under the ADA is on accessibility in practice, not just in following a checklist, but WCAG compliance is a strong indicator that you're on the right track.
Section 508 and WCAG, a direct connection.
Now, let's talk about the Section 508. Unlike the ADA, Section 508 is explicitly tied to the WCAG. In 2017, the Section 508 was updated to WCAG 2.0 Level AA as the standard for federal websites and technology. This means that for federal agencies, meeting the WCAG criteria isn't just recommended, it's mandatory.
Exactly. Under Section 508, there's a direct, legal requirement to follow WCAG 2.0 Level AA. This is different from the ADA, where WCAG is more of a best practice guide. If you're working on a federal website, failing to meet these criteria is a violation of Section 508.
Gotcha. So, Section 508 is, let's say, stricter than the ADA when it comes to web accessibility?
In some ways, yes. Section 508 has clear, defined standards that must be met. But remember, it only applies to federal agencies and contractors, while the ADA applies more broadly to public-facing websites.
A practical code example.
Okay, enough talking. Now let's get practical, okay guys? Imagine that you are working on a web form for a government agency. Section 508 requires that all interactive elements, like forms, are accessible to people with disabilities. One common issue is making sure form fields are properly labeled so that screen readers can identify them. Say you got a simple form with a text input field for an email address. To make this accessible, you need to ensure that the label is properly associated with the input field. Here's a quick code example.
Less form greater. Less label for equals email greater email address, less / label greater. Less input type equals email ID equals email name equals email ARIA required equals true greater. Less button type equals submit greater submit less / button greater. Less / form greater.
The key here is the for attribute in the label tag, which links it to the ID of the input field. This ensures that when a screen reader user navigates to the input, they'll hear email address, so they know what information is required.
Ariel, that seems pretty straightforward. I wonder, what about validation errors?
Good catch, George. You'll also want to make sure any validation errors are conveyed to screen readers. Here's a quick addition to the previous example.
Less form greater. Less label for equals email greater email address, less / label greater. Less input type equals email. ID equals email. Name equals email. ARIA required equals true. ARIA described be equals email error greater. Less span. ID equals email error. Role equals alert greater please enter a valid email address. Less / span greater. Less button type equals submit greater submit less / button greater. Less / form greater.
Now, if there is an error, the screen reader will announce it, thanks to the area described by attribute, which points to the error message's ID, and the role alert makes sure the message is read out loud immediately. Section 508 compliance isn't just ticking boxes, it's about making sure everyone, regardless of ability, can interact with technology. And sometimes it's these small details that make all the difference.
What is most important?
From a web accessibility perspective, WCAG is crucial because it's the common thread between the ADA and Section 508. However, the context in which we are working, whether it's a federal agency, a private company, or a public website, will determine which law is most relevant.
Exactly. If you're building a website for a federal agency, WCAG compliance is non-negotiable because of Section 508. But for other websites, especially those covered by the ADA, you have some flexibility. The key is to ensure that the site is accessible in practice, not just on paper.
Nuances and potential pitfalls.
There are cases where something might be okay under one framework, but not the other. For example, WCAG allows for some flexibility in how you present content as long as it's accessible. But under Section 508, if you don't meet the exact criteria, you could be in violation.
That's a good point. Another example is color contrast. WCAG has specific guidelines for contrast ratios, which are critical for users with low vision. If you're building a federal website, you need to adhere strictly to these ratios under Section 508. But under the ADA, as long as the site is usable, you might not face the same legal repercussions if you don't meet the exact ratio.
Oh gosh, so, what's the takeaway here? Should I just follow WCAG? I mean, all the time?
Following WCAG is definitely a good practice, but understanding the context, whether it's the ADA, Section 508, or another regulation, is key. If you are in doubt, aim for WCAG 2.0 Level AA compliance. It is the standard reference for both Section 508 and many ADA-related lawsuits.
Final thoughts and a key quote.
To wrap things up, remember that ADA, Section 508, and WCAG all play together to create a more accessible digital world, but they do so in different ways. ADA is about broad accessibility for all public spaces, including the web, while Section 508 is about making sure federal technology meets specific accessibility standards. WCAG provides the technical roadmap that helps you navigate both.
Think of it like this: ADA is the destination, WCAG is the map, and Section 508 is the specific route federal agencies must take.
That makes sense, Susan. So, no matter what, keeping WCAG in mind is going to help me stay on the right path.
Exactly. By the way, here is a quote from former U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno.
The promise of the ADA was that all Americans would be guaranteed equal access to public places and public spaces, and that promise extends to the virtual world we live in today.
All right, Susan, George, thank you very much for participating in this imaginary conversation.
Thank you, Ariel. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been really helpful. Thanks.
I had an incredible time.
Absolutely.
Your podcast is fantastic.
You're the best, Ariel.
I won't miss
Awesome.
any new episodes
The
going
best.
forward.
Well, anyway. Thank you very much for joining me today on Web Accessibility for All. Remember, accessibility is not a privilege, it's a right. Keep working towards a more inclusive web. See you next time.
Thanks for joining us today. Subscribe for a new challenge next week. And don't be shy. Leave us a review or ask your accessibility questions online. See you next week for another episode of Web Accessibility for All.